understand, then make sure you chat and Dr. Lewis will get that question to me. With that, we will get started. So our agenda tonight is we're going to talk about the purpose, why you're completing the applications. We're going to look at the FAFSA in depth. We're going to look at the sections of the FAFSA, particularly those sections that are sometimes troublesome and difficult and sometimes confusing to answer. And then we'll look at a couple of resources that you'll have available for you should you have questions once you complete the application. So let's get started. So why complete the FAFSA? It's simple: to access funds and money to help pay for college and college-related expenses. Now, these funds come from various sources, including the federal government, the state government, the colleges themselves in the form of scholarships or institutional aid. And you must complete the FAFSA each year to qualify for financial aid. Information is subject to change, for an example, like the tax information or the salary information, and thus you complete the FAFSA each year to capture any changes. Plus, the methodology, which is used to calculate certain figures, may change, and therefore you have to complete it each year. So you complete it each year that you plan on being in college. So the reason why, the way this works is there's information on the FAFSA. The FAFSA is about 100 questions. About 35 of those questions are used to calculate a figure, this figure called the expected family contribution, which is what you see in the middle. On the FAFSA, you can list up to 10 schools. The schools will receive some information from the Department of Education from your FAFSA. Each school has a cost of attendance, which is the average to attend the school for 2 semesters or an academic year. Each school that you apply for admissions and list on the FAFSA will look at their cost of attendance, and they'll deduct the expected family contribution, which is a figure that's created when you submit the FAFSA. They'll deduct the expected family contribution. What's left over is financial need. Financial need is that figure that the schools will look at, and they'll look at the different sources and the different types of financial aid and try to meet the financial need. So again, you're completing the FAFSA each year to get the expected family contribution, which is that figure that's calculated each year when you submit the FAFSA. Now, different types of financial aid, some of the different types of financial aid. One type is grants. Grants is money that doesn't have to be paid back. An example of a grant is the federal Pell Grant, which is the largest federal grant. Another type of aid is loans. Loans must be paid back after you leave school or graduate. There's another type of financial aid, which is actually a job. It's called a work study or a work study job. You're awarded allocations to receive up to a certain amount in salary for the work that you do, which is typically on or near a campus, and the student will receive a regular check based on the hours worked, but that is awarded through work study. It's a very convenient type job. Your employer, which is usually the school, realizes that the student is a student first, and thus they're flexible with their hours worked, so a student can work around class time, school holidays, and things like spring break and winter break. And so they realize first and foremost that the student is a student first, and they work with the student as they allocate the hours in a work schedule. Another type of aid is scholarships, or what I refer to as institutional aid from the school. Sometimes scholarships can be outside of the school, but oftentimes that scholarship awarding company will want the student to complete the FAFSA. Now, the institutions will always want the student to complete a FAFSA. With scholarships, they may be renewable, and you have to meet the eligibility requirements in addition to completing the FAFSA. So information needed to complete the FAFSA. For students, they'll need their social security number, some financial information, and we'll talk a lot more about that later, like salary and tax information. For the FAFSA we're completing, it's going to be for 2019. Demographic information. Students will need a list of the colleges that they're considering. Parents will need the social security number if they have one. It is not required. financial information, demographic information, household size, and the number in the household that's in college. Now, you may not need these items in hand, but you'll need to know this information. In fact, with some of the salary and some of the tax information, you can get that directly from the IRS site using the IRS data retrieval tool, which we'll discuss more later. Now, I also mentioned parents. Most students will need parental information. Not all students, but the FAFSA will determine whether or not a student needs parental information. If a student needs parental information, they're referred to as a dependent student. If they don't need parental information, they're referred to as an independent student. As I said, the FAFSA has a series of questions that will determine whether or not parental information is needed. If a student can answer yes to any other questions or check a box in any other questions, the student is considered an independent student and will not need parental information. The FAFSA has some special terms and special definitions that are unique to FAFSA. One of those terms and one of those definitions is independent and dependent. It doesn't really truly speak to whether or not a student is truly independent or a student is truly dependent upon their parents. It's really about whether or not a student can answer yes to any other questions in that section. Again, if a student can answer yes to any one question, they're independent and won't need parental information. If they can't, they're dependent and will need parental information. Now, once a FAFSA determines if you need parental information, you have to use your biological or adopted parents, and only your biological or adopted parents in the parental section. And you shouldn't use anyone else's information except biological or adoptive parents. If parents are married and together, use information from both parents. If parents are not married but living together, use both parents' information. If a parent is single or widowed, then it's that parent's information. Now, if parents are divorced or separated, student has to determine which parent to use. That is typically the parent that the student lived with the most or the parent that provided the greatest support. And typically, the parent that the student lived with the most is the one that will be providing the greatest financial support. If that parent is remarried, the student must also use the step-parent's information. So to get started with the FAFSA, there are two ways that you can do it. At studentaid.gov, which is the Department of Education website, you can go to studentaid.gov, and then there's a pull-down menu, apply for financial aid, and you'll find the FAFSA there. Or if you type fafsa.gov directly into your web browser, you'll go directly to the application. Or there's an app, the My Student Aid app. You can complete the FAFSA on the My Student Aid app. These, whether you're doing the FAFSA online, which is the Student Aid Gov or FAFSA.gov, or the My Student Aid app, a student can use, and parents can use a combination. A student can start on the app, the parents can complete it online, or vice versa. The app and the FAFSA online are in sync, and oftentimes students will use the app and the parents will use it online. And it doesn't matter, they're in sync. There's a different view because on the app, the questions are viewed one at a time, whereas on the FAFSA online, you may see several questions, but they're in order and they are synced. This is the front page of the FAFSA. Most students new to the FAFSA will click on Start Here. If you're a returning user, you've completed a FAFSA before, or you started a FAFSA and didn't finish, you would click as a returning user and click Login. The next page is the login screen. If it is the student, they will click I am a student. Parents can start or begin the FAFSA with the student by clicking on I'm a parent, and they can use some qualifying information from the student, or if the student has started a FAFSA and use a save key, they can access the student's FAFSA by the qualifying information and the save key. And we'll see that in just a minute. Next, logging into the FAFSA, the student will use their FSA ID. Most students won't have one, and you can click the button here, create an FSA ID. An FSA ID is a username and a password. When you click here, you'll go to a site, and that is created. It is helpful if a student has an email address and a cell number. Oftentimes, the students will use their email address as their username. But you have to be careful. Don't use a school-issued email address. You don't use a school-issued email address because once a student graduates from high school, within a week or so, that's going to be deactivated. Also, at least one parent must create an FSA ID if a parent has a social security number. You can't use the same email address. It's also helpful to use your email address and your cell number when creating it, because if you forget, you get locked out, you forget it, you can use that to reset the FSA ID. Again, the student will need to create one, and at least one parent will need to create one. And if you don't have it, you both can create it from here. First, the student would do it, and then the parent can do it. Next is a disclaimer. Basically says that this is a federal site and you shouldn't be here. If you're not supposed to be, you have to accept. For our purposes today, if you go to the FAFSA site, you'll see an option of creating two FAFSAs. One is for the current academic year, which is now. But for our purposes tonight, we're discussing the 2020-2022 FAFSA, which will be that year that students that are seniors now that are graduating in May and June, going to school in the fall, they're going to be creating the 2020-2022. Now, it is very possible that maybe tonight we have some students that are graduating early, or they're finishing up and graduating at the end of this semester, or they're going to summer school in college, and they may need to create a 2020-2021. You should ask the college that you, the student, will be attending if you need to create a 2020-2021. Everyone that's listening to this program will be completing the 2021-2022 FAFSA, and that's what we're talking about. Again, it's possible you may have to do the other FAFSA. Next is the save key that we mentioned earlier. This is a 4 to 8 digit key. The neat thing about the save key, we mentioned that the student creates this. The student can share the save key with parents, so the parents can do their section. The save key is created and was meant to be shared with the student and the parent. Students and parents should not share the FSA ID, but one of the reasons the save key was created so that students can share with parents, so that if the students and parents aren't together, the parent can do their section. For an example, if you have students here that'll be graduating, but they'll be in college in October, the FAFSA is available in October, you don't have to wait till the student comes home during winter break to create start the FAFSA. A student could go in, do their section of the FAFSA, contact you, the parent, give them the save key, and you, the parent, could go in, do your section, sign it, notify your child that the FAFSA, you've done your section, then they'll go back in and do the FAFSA. So the save key, neat little feature that allows the students and the parents to access the FAFSA so the parents can do their section when they're not together. I'm going to stop for just a moment to ask LaShonda, Dr. Lewis, if we have any questions, and also to take a brief sip of water.
Thank you, Richard. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. And the first one is, does the parent fill the FAFSA or the student? Who completes the FAFSA?
Technically, it's the student's FAFSA, and the student should be completing the FAFSA. There's a section for the parents that they should complete, but it is really the student's FAFSA. I know sometimes parents will complete the FAFSA in lieu of their student, but really the reality is the student should be creating the FAFSA. The parents should be doing their section of the FAFSA. Now, they may sit together because sometimes the student will need some information or they'll need to figure it out together. But the reality of it is it's the student's FAFSA. Great question.
Thank you. And we have one more question. What gives the greatest financial aid to students, being a dependent or independent student?
Kind of a difficult question, but I'll propose a scenario. So probably when you say the greatest financial aid, when a student is independent, they're not using parental information. And so when a student is dependent, it's the student's financial information, all their information. It's always the student's information plus the parents' information. And so typically, probably students that are not using parental information because they are an independent student may have a lower expected family contribution. Not always, but sometimes you see that because they're only using the student's information. Now, some reasons that can affect it also is like the household size. And so it's not just salary and income, but it's also household size. If a student is a independent student, then typically they're going to have a smaller household size. But the fact is probably because it's just the student's salary and information, probably, but not always, and an independent student.
And another question that just popped up. What are the benefits of creating a FAFSA?
The benefits of doing a FAFSA, well, you will not qualify, you won't be able to receive federal financial aid and state financial aid unless you complete a FAFSA. There's a weird exception of a type of loan that you may be eligible for, but that's all. Any student that's hoping to get financial aid has to create the FAFSA. Some students may not be eligible for federal financial aid, and we'll talk about a form called the TASFA a little later. But yeah, it's so that you can qualify for all types of financial aid. And in Texas, you know, if you're eligible for federal financial aid, you create the FAFSA, and then you're applying for federal and state financial aid. And most institutions will use the FAFSA to determine your eligibility for their institutional aid.
And sorry.
I was just saying, again, another great question.
Is the FAFSA only for student loans?
The FAFSA is not only for student loans. Student loans is one type of financial aid, but there are other types of financial aid. We mentioned the grants. We mentioned scholarships. We mentioned the work-study program. So student loans are a big part of financial aid, I have to be honest, but it's not just student loans. And depending on where you're going and what you're eligible for, you may not have to take student loans.
Thank you, Richard. That's all the questions we have in the chat right now.
Thank you, and please keep the questions coming. So for our purposes tonight, we're going to look at a FAFSA for a dependent student, which will need parental information. First is the student's information, which is the student's address, and that's straightforward. It's things that you've entered as a student on many forms before. Next is a question about residence. They'll ask you if you lived in the state for 5 years. And next is going to be a eligibility question. Are you a citizen or an eligible non-citizen? It's a pull-down menu. Actually, that's the same slide. And next is some information, the student information. They'll ask, or will they have a high school diploma? What degree will they be working on when they enter school for that academic year, 2021, 2022? But also one question I wanted to point out is we know that we have some gifted and talented students that are in early college, high school, and their IB programs, and they place dot. And sometimes these students will graduate high school, sometimes already with an associate's degree, and sometimes with several hours that will make them a sophomore and sometimes a junior. For FAFSA purposes, even though they have the credit hours to make them a sophomore or junior, you should click here when it asks what will your college grade level be when you begin the 2020-21 school year, and that should be the 2021-2022. It is never attended college first year, even though they have the hours, because this is really about that first year that they're in college. So even though they have the hours to make them a sophomore or junior, the answer here is never attended college first year. Next is a question about It'll ask if the student is a male or female. Males have to be registered with the Selective Service. Most males haven't registered with Selective Service. And if they haven't, they'll ask if you're registered. You check no, and then you can check a yes here to register with Selective Service. And through the FAFSA, you will be registered with Selective Service. And you don't have to do a separate registration. So the first question is male, and they're asking me that, are you male or female? Because as a male, you have to register with Selective Service. If you were to check female, then you wouldn't see these questions. And one thing the FAFSA has is something called skip logic. Based on the way you answer questions, not everybody's FAFSA is going to be the same. For an example, here a female won't see the Selective Service questions. And by male or female, they're meaning gender that was assigned at birth. Next is a student driver's license question. Students do not have to have a driver's license in order to qualify for federal financial aid in order to complete the FAFSA. This question was probably asked by states or colleges. Not all questions are directly related to being awarded federal aid. If you don't have a student driver's license, you can skip this question. You don't have to run out and get one. Next question we'll ask is, are you the student or foster youth or at any time in the foster care system? Next question we'll ask highest grade level completed by parent 1 and parent 2. The FAFSA refers to parents as parent 1 and parent 2, or parent 1 and other parent. For this question, this is your biological or adopted parents. And again, only biological or adopted parents is the parental information that they're seeking. Next is the search for the high school. This is where students will enter their high school that they're currently attending and that they'll graduate from. The easiest way to do this is to put the city and the state, and then you'll get a listing of all the high schools. So if you'll just put city, state, you'll get a listing. The reason why that's the easiest, because depending on the way the database works, the high school may be a different name, or it may be named something. Sometimes we see schools as the high is the first name, the name, first and second name, and then high school. Sometimes we see the last name and then HS. The easiest way is to put in the city, the state, and then you'll get a listing of all the schools, and then you just simply click on select, and then that's done. This becomes really important because there's a couple of things that'll happen. There is a lead counselor at each school that's able to see detailed FAFSA data of students. And so they can see that the student has completed their FAFSA. They can see if the FAFSA was rejected, and though the student has a confirmation letter, the FAFSA may have been rejected later, much later in the process. If the student was selected for verification, they're able to see that also. And then so counselors can, by looking at that portal that they can access to Apply Texas, if they've done the agreement with TEA, and I think most counselors in our area in Round Rock ISD will have access to that. And so sometimes students, may not know that their FAFSA was rejected, or they may have missed the information that they were selected for verification. And so by putting the high school in, they're going to be able to get access to that information. Also, for parents that are here in this session tonight, if you have a son or daughter that is a junior, their senior year, they're going to be required to submit the FAFSA. And one way to know that they submitted the FAFSA is that they enter the high school correctly, so that the counselor can see and acknowledge that they've completed the FAFSA. It's not a requirement. We highly recommend it now, but for the class of 2022, it's going to be a graduation requirement. Next is the college selection information. They'll ask if you know the federal school code. Most people don't know school's federal school code, but the easiest way, or the way I find the best to get this college information, is if you'll put in the state. If you'll put in the state, not just the city, not the city, but the state, then you get an alphabetical listing of all the colleges in that state, and then you scroll through and you select that college. The reason why I say the state and not the city and state, because there are a couple of colleges that has a city name that's listed in, but it's actually technically in a different city. The best example of that is UT Dallas. If you put in Dallas and you put in Texas, you won't find it because it's located in the city of Richardson. So if you put in Texas, then you'll get a listing of all of those, or whatever state that you're applying. Also, there are some colleges, we know them as a name that's not truly their name, like Georgia Tech. If you try to put in Georgia Tech, you wouldn't find it because that's technically not its real name. And so putting in the state will give you that alphabetical listing. And we recommend also, you can list up to 10 colleges. We recommend, even though your son or daughter, parents or students, even though you know you're going to one school, we recommend that you list several schools in this section. You can list up to 10. We recommend that you list several, not just the school that you've been accepted to. If you apply to an institution, we recommend that you list it, even though you may have made your decision already, which college you're going to attend, just in case. It could be something happens and maybe you change your mind. If you list it now, you don't have to go back and add it later on. And again, you can list up to 10. I usually get this, and I'm sure somebody is thinking this: what happens if I have more than 10? What happens if I have 12? You can only list 10. So I recommend that you list the 10, wait a few days, maybe 4 or 5, or maybe a full week, go back in, remove a couple, and then add the additional schools that you want. Because each of the schools will get a report from the Department of Education. And so if you go in before they remove that report is sent, then you're changing that, because those will be removed from your FAFSA. And so if you have more than 10, list 10, wait about a week, go back in, and then add a couple more. But to add a couple more, you have to take off a couple more. As I said, once you list all the schools, you'll get like you put in the state, you'll get this listing, you'll get a listing. If you check the box, it'll add it. If you want to add more schools, you click add more schools, and then you go back and do that process again. Next, it'll ask the housing plan of each of the colleges. The housing options are on campus, off campus, or with parents. Housing option again is on campus, off campus, or with parents. Before we move into another section, I'm going to pause for just a moment to see if there are any questions.
Yes, we actually have quite a few questions this go around. So let me make sure I'm going back up to where we left off. Once you enter information into the FAFSA, are you able to go back in and make changes?
You are able to go back in and make changes. Now, when you first complete the FAFSA, say you're doing the FAFSA tonight, and you want to make a change later on tonight, or you want to make a change tomorrow, you're probably going to have to wait a couple of days for that initial, before you can make that initial change. The reason why is that there are some things that are happening in the background. But after a couple of days, you can go back in, make changes, make updates, correct something that was incorrect, or you want to add an additional school, you can. But it's just that first time when you first do it, it's a couple of days that it may be locked. But after that, then you're free to go back and make changes. There's a couple of checks that the FAFSA does. One is with the Social Security Administration. One is with the Selective Service. One is with the IRS, if you use IRS data retrieval tool. So there are things going on in the background. I think that's why you can't, actually it's because of the Social Security Administration. But after a couple of days, once you initially sign and submit the FAFSA, after a couple of days, you can go back in and make corrections or make updates.
Thank you. So this question is kind of multi-leveled. So when do we start the application process, and when does it need to be done? And then also, does it matter if my child is graduating in December of this year as opposed to May or June?
Great question, multi-layered, and I'm going to break it down. Each year, the FAFSA becomes available on October 1st for the next academic year. And this is what the FAFSA we're talking about. So on October 1st, the FAFSA for the academic year 2021, 2022 is available. We recommend that you do it. A lot of times we say soon as possible, but do it, October, November, maybe now in December. So in theory, it could be done at any part during the academic year, but the reality of it is the year started, you could possibly be missing out on aid. For an example, there are students that are in college now, because now is the 2020, 2021 academic year, and a student in college now could actually still complete the current FAFSA up until June 30th. But why wait until the very end? Because that's the very end. So the reality of it is, do the FAFSA hopefully in the fall before the academic year that you will be enrolled. Maybe you got it figured out. Maybe you had it all figured out. Maybe you're able to pay for the first semester on your own. Now you can't. You can still go back and do the FAFSA. We recommend that even if you have it figured out, still do it and try to do it in the fall. Now in Texas, we have a priority deadline of January the 15th. And the reality of it is, if you do it after January 15th, you could be missing out on some state aid that you may be eligible for if you do it and you submit it by January the 15th. So do it in the fall, but certainly do it before January 15th because you want to meet the state priority deadline. Was there another part of that question? Oh, the student that was graduating in December. You're saying you have a student, you have a child that's graduating in December. I'm going to make an assumption that your December graduate is going to start college in January. You should be doing the 2020, 2021 FAFSA, and you can do that now. It's available. Remember, early in the presentation, I showed you the 2 FAFSAs. So you're going to have to do, or you should be doing 2 FAFSAs. You should be doing the 2020, 2021, so that your son or daughter can get aid this spring semester starting in January, but also do the 2021, 2022, which is what we're focusing on tonight, so that he or she can become eligible for aid during that academic year.
Thank you. I think that covered all parts of that question. So
Okay,
our next question, how will we know what the exact amount of financial aid we will receive? Is it the same as the cost of attendance, the EFC formula?
It's not the same as the cost of attendance. It's going to be based on several criteria. And so just recapping that, you're going to have an EFC. The student's going to have an EFC, which is expected family contribution. The school's going to have a cost of attendance, which is unique to that institution. What's left over is going to be that figure of need or financial need that the school will try to meet using the different types of financial aid from the different sources. They'll try to meet that. And to be honest, not all schools are always able to meet that. And so to give you a figure of how much, when will you know, the school will send an award letter. And that award letter is going to basically state some of those things that I said. It's going to say, hey, this is our cost of attendance. This is your expected family contribution. What's left over is the financial need. And this is how we can meet the financial need with the offer letter that they'll send you. They'll list the different types and different amounts per semester that they'll make available. And then the student will have to determine if that's going to meet the family's need. Oftentimes students will compare award offers from various institutions, especially if they've been admitted to the institution and those are the institutions that they want to attend. But one of the things that may be a surprise, actually it's a couple of things that may be a surprise, particularly for parents, is the figure of the expected family contribution may be a surprise for parents, but also realize that not all institutions are able to meet the financial need. And that's when students can fill in those gaps by applying for scholarships outside scholarships, which means not FAFSA, but scholarships from various entities. They can help meet that by being very diligent in applying for those scholarships.
Thank you. So I'm going to rephrase this question, but it goes back to the amount of time the child has lived in the state of Texas, do you count that time as when they're actually in your house, or if they're off to college in, let's say, California, are they still considered a Texas resident, or how does that work?
You know, that's an interesting question, because I'll tell you, because it's really the time leading up to high school. But if they're going to remain as part of your household, then that's still going to be a Texas resident. Now, one of the unique things is oftentimes some states will say, for the initial year, initial couple of years, you're not a resident, but you may qualify for residency for a particular state based on that state's, residential laws. And so initially, that first time, I mean, obviously that's pretty easy, right? Because you're a resident of Texas, but depending on where they're going and how they're going, and some states have different ways of figuring that out, if you're attending, if you're working, and some of those things. And so really, if you have a son or daughter that's going to another state, I would look into that state to see how they qualify as a resident, because if they do qualify as a resident, particularly if they're going to a state institution, it could mean a big difference in the tuition that they're going to be charged, whether they're charged in state or out of state.
Thank you. Let me see here. Do divorced parents have to enter step parent information? Some places said bio parents, others, but I thought that you mentioned step parents.
Yeah, I'll explain that, and that can be very confusing. So let's take a scenario where, say, a student's parents are divorced. They got divorced when the student was in the 9th grade. Student lives with his mom. And so he lives with the mom. The mom is providing more than half the financial support. The student is going to use the mom's information. The student will not use the dad's information because they're divorced. He's going to use the mom's information. If the mom gets remarried, then that student would have to use the stepdad's information. But when parents are divorced, you either use one parent or the other parent. But if that parent that you're using is remarried, then yes, you use the step parent's information. Did I get it?
I think you did, but if not, whoever asked that question, feel free to add another question to the chat. Next question, then I think we probably should go back to the presentation, and we'll get to the other questions here shortly. Is it true that schools will utilize the order of schools listed in the student's FAFSA when they are determining acceptance?
No. As a matter of fact, that was a rumor. In fact, some schools used to do it. Schools no longer see which institutions were listed on the student's FAFSA. So you apply to one institution, you list 10 institutions on the FAFSA. That institution doesn't have access to the other schools that you listed on the FAFSA.
Okay, thank you. And we'll let you get back to your presentation, and we'll come back to questions here shortly.
Okay, we're in the final 1/3, final 1/4, so hang in with me. Great questions. Next, we move into the dependency status section. The next question is the student's marital status, and that's the marital status as of the day that the FAFSA will be submitted. Then it asks, does the student have dependents? Well, the first one is asked that if the student has a child that's receiving more than half of their support during that academic year. Next one asks if they have other dependents that are receiving more than half of their support during the academic year. The student is applying for aid. Again, if a student were to answer yes, that student would be an independent for FAFSA purposes and wouldn't need parental information. And then there are some additional questions, and then this is where a student would check if this was applicable. One feature I need to point out is the question mark. If you're not certain what the question is asking, or you need a better explanation, if you'll click on the question mark, which is at the end of each question. It'll take you to a different screen, and sometimes there's even a link from there. It'll take you to more information so that you will know how to answer that question. For an example, this question asks about an emancipated minor. You're not sure what an emancipated minor is. If you were to click here, hopefully you'll get a better explanation that you can answer any of these questions here. Another feature that I didn't point out earlier was to navigate to the FAFSA, you use the next and the previous button. Don't use the browser navigation, that takes you out of the FAFSA. Navigating through the FAFSA is previous and next. Next is a homeless question, which asks as a date, was the student homeless or at risk of being homeless? And again, if you don't know what homeless is, self-supporting or risk of being homeless, clicking here will give you a better explanation. On this particular question, if the student were to answer yes, they would get 3 more questions that they would have to answer. In this particular, that's the dependency status, that's the dependency determiner. Next, because we weren't able to answer yes or check any of the boxes, this is the FAFSA is saying that you'll have to provide information for your parent. And then you click next, and you'll have the parental information questions. It'll ask for the parent's marital status, and then the date. If they were married or divorced, they would ask for the date, month, and year. Next, they're going to ask personal information for our example. We had students' parents were married. They're asking information for first parent and then other parent. It's going to ask for the parent's social security number. If a parent doesn't have a social security number, you enter all zeros, and you can go through this. Last name, first initial, date of birth. It's going to ask for first parent's email address. This is important because in subsequent years, the Department of Education will send this parent an email that says, hey, the FAFSA is available. You were a parent of a dependent student. Do you need to complete, or does your child need to complete another FAFSA? That's one of the reasons they're asking for this email address. And then it's going to ask for the same information for the other parent, except for the email address. It's not going to ask for an email address. Next is the household size. Where you see the gray bar means that this was added earlier. And so when you get here, because it was 2 parents that was there, because it's the student that was there, the next question is your parents' other children, even if they don't live with your parents, if your parents will provide more than half of their support during that academic year you're applying for aid, or they can answer no to every question. Basically, if they filled out a FAFSA, the other children filled out a FAFSA, they would need parental information. And so you add parents of the children. Again, if they're in the home or they're outside of the home, if the parents are providing more than half of their support, or if they did the FAFSA, they would need parental information. Notice one thing it didn't say, it doesn't have an age here. And it doesn't say and, it says are. So parents, other children that are in the home, or, your parents provide more than half of their support. And so it could be adult children that the parents are taking care of and providing for. So you put that number there. And then next is other people that live with parents. Your parents provide more than half of their support, and they will, during that academic year, the student is applying for aid. You would add other people. So it's the parents, the students, parents, other children in or outside the home if the parents are providing half of their support. And then other people that are in the home and will be in the home during that academic year that the parents are providing more than half of their support. A good example of this would be a grandparent that's retired living in the home and the parents are taking care of the grandparent. That's a good example. This adds automatically. For our example here, it was 6, the parent, the student, 2 siblings, and another person in the home the parents were taking care of. And the last question in this section, of the number of people in the household size, in the household, how many will be in college during that academic year? We know it's always going to be 1 because it's the student, but anyone else that's going to be in college, but not the parents. And so you can't include that the parents were in college. You can't include the parents in this number. It's the student and anyone else that'll be in college, but not the parent is that number. This is a very important section, direct correlation to the figure of expected family contribution. And because it's a very important section, I'm going to pause for just one quick second to see if there's any questions in this section of what I previously covered.
Okay, let's see. So from previous, is it okay to list colleges that you haven't applied for?
You can list colleges that you haven't applied to. They'll get your information. They probably will not act on it until you apply. Some colleges, once you apply, they'll act on it. Some colleges will wait until you've been admitted. But yeah, it's perfectly fine. In fact, you know, because you can list 10, it could be the colleges that you intend to apply that you haven't. Go ahead and list them in the FAFSA.
Do we have to complete both the FAFSA and TASFA applications?
No, you never have to complete them both. The TASFA is for students that are not eligible for federal financial aid. They may be eligible for state financial aid. If you're eligible for federal financial aid, then you complete the FAFSA, and then the institutions will use that to qualify for you for state financial aid. Never complete them. You never have to complete them both.
Okay, and there was earlier you mentioned the need for, or not need, but a question pertaining to the student's driver's license number. Can we enter in the student's learning permit number?
I wouldn't, because it's asking very specifically for a driver's license number. Again, it is not used for federal aid. It's not used for state aid. Quite frankly, I'm not sure why that question was there. I know why. I mean, it was requested by colleges or it was requested by our state. But if you don't have a driver's license, leave it blank and just go on, because they're very specific in what they're asking for.
Okay, and then I've heard that the students only qualify for a certain amount of financial aid in their name, and then the parent must carry the balance. Can you explain how that works?
Not exactly sure, but I can try to interpret. So a student will qualify, you know, for financial aid. It is possible, and I think what the question is in reference to, there's different types of financial aid, and part of financial aid can be, part of the financial aid offer can be an offer for a parent to have a loan that's called a PLUS, or a parent loan. And that could be what is being referenced, where to meet their need, the student is awarded aid, the student may have loans or a loan, and then they may have the parent have a loan called a PLUS or plus loan that is to help the student meet the cost of attendance. Now, the beginning part of it was saying students only qualify for a certain amount. I can tell you that the students will not be awarded more than the cost of attendance for an institution. So for an example, if it costs $20,000 a year to attend an institution, then the maximum amount of aid that could be offered to a student would be the $20,000. Institutions aren't allowed to offer more than the cost of attendance.
And I think it's also just important to remember, like Richard said, that there is different types of aid. So by completing a FAFSA, that makes you eligible. So I think when people think of the FAFSA, they only think of student loans, but you can get scholarships, you can get Pell Grants, and potentially work study programs. And so I think this question may have been specifically regarding student loans. So there is a cap to each year on how much a student can get in student loans. But if we're talking about scholarships or Pell Grants or work study, that is a little bit different. Richard, do you happen to know what the cap for student loans per student per year is?
I do not offhand, but it varies between the first year is an amount, second year, and then third and fourth year is an amount. And I think that total amount, don't quote me, but I think that total amount may be about $27,000, but I'm not sure. It's been a minute since I looked at that figure, but I do know that it's a different amount each year that the student may be eligible for. And then it's capped at a certain amount. There may be some extenuating circumstances that may cause them, student, to be able by petitioning or speaking with the financial aid office to be awarded more than that. But there is a cap of a yearly amount and an aggregate amount.
Thank you. And then this is our last question that's currently in the chat. It goes back to the time in which a student lives, in this case, in Texas. We moved to Texas in 2016. So as of today, it's not 5 years. However, by the time the student starts college in the fall, it will be 5 years. Does that impact financial aid at all if they have not lived in a state for 5 years?
Well, that would, it has an impact, but that 5 years was a question, and honestly, I'm not sure where the 5 years came from. It was requested by a state. They've lived in Texas, and I think they're saying 3 years, and they're going to be eligible for state residency. So don't be stuck on the 5 year. That's not a federal aid question. The FAFSA has 100 questions, about 100 questions. About 30, 32, 33 are directly related to the expected family contribution. There are several other questions that were requested on the FAFSA by some states and some institutions. We've talked about one, the driver's license. The driver's license is not used in the calculation for expected family contribution, but a state or an institution, or states or institutions, ask for that. So every question on the FAFSA is not a direct correlation to awarding of federal aid. It's probably because an institution or state requested that and they needed that for their benefit. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it made it where the student wouldn't have to fill out a separate application. And so that's why you see some questions because they were requested and they're not necessarily federal aid related or expected family contribution related.
Thank you for explaining that, Richard. That's all of our questions currently in the chat, so we'll turn it back over to your presentation.
Thank you. Next is parent tax filing. It will ask for the FAFSA that we're discussing. It's going to be the tax filing year 2019. It's going to ask if they completed it, the type of tax. And this information you see, the IRS data retrieval tool, that's not going to be here when these questions, or when you initially get to this page. As you answer, then if you're eligible to use the IRS data retrieval tool, this will appear. They're asking these questions to see if you can use a feature called the IRS data retrieval tool. This feature allows you to leave the FAFSA, go to the IRS, have information copied from the IRS into your FAFSA. Based on the way these questions were answered, it says that applying is easier and faster if you use this tool, and then they say use this tool. Now remember earlier when I said to navigate through the FAFSA, you use the previous and the next. You may see this, but you're used to going next, and if you go next, then you get to the next screen and it'll say, hey, we want you to use the IRS data retrieval tool. You can link here. It's like, oh yeah, of course, I want to use the IRS data retrieval tool. You click here, and then you'll link to the IRS. Next screen, you'll see it will tell you that you're leaving the FAFSA, and then you're at the IRS site. Notice it's different. There's a standard warning there. So click OK. Some information will already be there, like the name, social security number. And then there's other information that you'll have to add, and that's the information of the address. This is very critical in being able to use the IRS data retrieval tool. This information must be character for character, verbatim, as when the taxes were filed. So if you move since the taxes were filed, still use the address that was used when taxes were filed. Not only the address, but it has to be a character for character match. For an example, if you live on Maple Street and when your taxes were filed, you wrote Maple, S-T-R-E-E-T, then you have to write S-T-R-E-E-T. You can't write S-T period. You live in an apartment and you put hashtag and then the number. You can't put APT period and then the number. It has to be an exact match. This is looking for a match, and the match has to be exact. If it is, then you click on submit. And when you click on submit, it'll say, hey, this is 2019 federal tax information. This figure here is the information that's going to be transferred to your taxes. It's not going to tell you the amounts of the figures. It's just going to say these are the things that are going to be transferred. If you'll click here, this will turn blue, and you click transfer now. Then you'll go back to the FAFSA, and where information was transferred, you'll know that it's highlighted in bold. Again, you won't see the actual figures, but you will see that it was transferred. Now, most people are able to use the IRS data retrieval tool, but not everyone. And so the information can still be entered manually. And you'll find information here, and it'll tell you, this amount is found on form 10. It'll tell you where to find it. This can be confusing sometimes. A new feature is if you'll click here, it'll give you more information. And in fact, it'll show you a picture of where that information can be found on that particular form, on that particular line. But again, if you can't use the data retrieval tool, you can still enter the information. There's other information that must be entered. And so that's just tax information. One thing that I wanted to bring out is usually the FAFSA is referencing a particular year. This particular question is a 2-year thing, 2019 to 2020. Did the parent or anyone in the parent's household receive any of these benefits? And it has these benefits, and you check that box if so. There are some additional questions. Most of these questions are capturing taxed and untaxed income, but there are additional questions. Unlike other questions on the FAFSA, this is already populated with 0. So if that doesn't affect you or there's no figure, the 0 is already there and you would go next. If it does, then you write in that figure. Not sure what they are, click on the question mark, and it'll give you a better explanation. The FAFSA has some skip logic. Not all FAFSAs are the same. Depending on the information that was entered, you may have a question that reads something like this. Does a total amount of your assets exceed a certain amount? And if it does, then you'll have the option of skipping. I mean, if it does not, if you no, then you'll have an option of skipping certain questions. This question, but again, not everyone will see this question. Just kind of depends on information that was entered earlier. And so for this particular one, that they did not exceed that amount, it was no. So they asked, do you want to skip the questions? If you're allowed to skip the questions, the Department of Education is saying, we don't need additional information from the parent or the student, from the parent's income and assets. So you can skip that. So you can, if you have that option, you can certainly do it. Again, not everyone will see that. That figure will be different. Sometimes it'll be a larger or a higher figure. And then there's the same information for parents that the student will do. The same tax information, or the same tax question. They can access the data retrieval tool too if the student worked and filed taxes. Now, if the student worked and didn't file taxes, they can still enter the information that they earned in 2019. If you scroll through it, you'll see where they're asking for their income from working. And so sometimes students will work, sometimes they won't file taxes, and so they can't use the data retrieval tool, but they can still manually enter the information that they of their earnings from 2019. One thing I did want to point out, and this is for parents that have students or for students for when they're filling out the FAFSA the next time, there's a question on the FAFSA that asks for taxable earnings from need-based employment programs, such as federal work study. So parents, if you have a son or daughter that's in college now and they have a work study job, that's where this they could work, file taxes, and use the IRS data retrieval tool like you normally would do. But also they need to go back in, and if they had a work study job, put in that amount here. And the reason is because work study is designed to assist students as they're in college. The Department of Education is saying, hey, we want to not include the money worked as work study when we're calculating the expected family contribution. So you put in the work study amount here, and they're not going to use that figure when they calculate the expected family contribution. Again, Probably not applicable to students that are seniors now in high school. Well, obviously it's not. But I added that for the benefit of parents that may have children in college. Make sure that you put that figure, because that's missed oftentimes by current college students when they're doing their next FAFSA, which, by the way, when we talked about this, you know the FAFSA is done every year. Next, we're almost at the very end of the FAFSA. There's a question that asks, are you a preparer? This is rare. A preparer is a person that's paid to help assist with FAFSA. Next is a summary. The summary is a listing of all the answers on the FAFSA. The answers are to the right, the questions on the left. Review that. If it's not correct or you want to go back and look at it, you click on the blue link on the left, and it'll take you back to that section so you can reread it, and if you need to, update it. Next is the signature. A student will need to sign and a parent will need to sign. There's a agreement term. You have to agree to the agreement terms. Go next, and then for the student, they click sign the FAFSA. They only click and sign the FAFSA because they used their FSA ID previously. And so you go back, and what you want to see is you want to see that check mark in the green circle. That means that that's signed. Next, a parent will need to sign. If you click provide parent signature, and last, if it's going to be parent 1 or parent 2, you have to select which one. And then the parent will put in their FSA ID if they hadn't used it before. If they have used it before, it would be just like the student, where they would click sign the FAFSA. They'll have to go to the disclaimer. They have to do that. But again, if they haven't used it, they would have to put it in here. If they hadn't created it, now will be the time that they'll have to create it. But if neither parent has a Social Security number, there are other options to sign and submit the FAFSA. If you'll click at the bottom here, and that option is to print a signature page. So now the parent has a Social Security number, you have to print the signature page. You print the signature page, you sign it, you mail it to the address that's on the signature page. When it's received, the FAFSA will be processed. So again, if no Social Security number, you must print the signature page. You'll have to enter the information from if you worked and filed taxes, you'll have to manually enter that. You won't be able to use that. You won't be able to use the feature. But ultimately, this is what you want. The parent, this is for parents that had a Social Security number. You want that check in the green box. Student assigned, parent assigned. Next step is to submit my FAFSA now. Submit my FAFSA now. You'll get a confirmation page. It's going to have a confirmation number. It's going to have the expected family contribution, and it's going to have the schools that were listed on the FAFSA. This confirmation page is also going to be mailed to, it's going to be emailed to the student's email address. The student will provide an email address, and a version of the confirmation page is going to be emailed to the student. So I'm going to pause here and see. I know we're a little over time. Still got a couple more things to go, but I'm going to pause here. Actually, no, I'm going to list a couple of resources and then we'll pause. Just a couple of resources. At Trellis Company, which is the company I work for, we have a website called AIE.org, which recently changed to Mosaic.org. There's a lot of FAFSA completion information. We have new videos in English and Spanish of completing the FAFSA and the TASFA. There's a couple of links to those. You can take a picture of those, or if you just go to mosaic.org and then you'll do the search, do FAFSA video, and it'll take you to the video. Studentaid.gov is a Department of Education website. A wealth of information there. That's also where you complete the FAFSA. But also there's much more information. Someone earlier asked about loans and about how much per year. I could go to studentaid.gov and I can find the answer to that question. A lot of information on loans, work study, grants, other information at studentaid.gov. And lastly, the federal number, 1-800-4FED-AID. This is particularly good, especially if you have problems with the FSA ID or any questions. This is the federal number. It's going to take a while before you get to somebody, but ultimately you'll be able to get to somebody that can help you should you have trouble. I'm going to pause now to see if we have questions.
Thank you. And I'm going to actually piggyback off your last statement there. The FSA ID, is it issued as soon as the student and parent applies, or is there a waiting period?
No, it's issued as soon as the parent, as soon as you apply. In fact, you create the FSA ID. It's not issued. It's created by the student. It's created by the parent. So they create the username. They, meaning the student and the parent, will create their own username, will create their own password. I think that question has probably come from someone that completed a FAFSA a few years ago when they used to use something else instead of FSA ID. They used a PIN, which was issued a couple of days afterwards, and then they ultimately got to real-time PIN. But now this is done, created by the user, the student or the parent.
Thank you. And I think this is asking you to go back to skipped questions on the parent section. I need clarification about exactly what finances be reported. Do I report my IRA, teacher retirement, or is it just bank accounts, mutual funds, and investments?
Okay, so I won't be able to skip to it, but it's very clear of what information, and then if it's not clear, if you'll click on the question mark, it'll tell you. And so there's always some questions, but that is populated with a 0. If that applies to you, if you click on that, it can give you more information. And so whether it's a retirement, which by the way, they're not asking for 401ks, that information. There are certain programs that they're asking for, but if you'll go to the question, you'll read it. And if you're not sure, if you'll click on the question mark, it'll take you to another screen that'll give you a longer and more detailed explanation.
Thank you. Also, if parents are divorced and form is filled out by parent 1, who is not remarried, is parent 2 still considered other biological parent?
So repeat the question again, please.
If parents are divorced and parent 1 is not remarried, is parent 2 still considered the other biological parent?
They're not, I'm going back to the question. This is parents. They would only have, so the way this viewed, the way you saw that was because we use married parents. If the parents are divorced, you will only see that one parent. And so the reason why you saw 2 is because in our example, we use 2 parents. Say for an example, if you use a parent that was divorced, like they're saying, a parent that's divorced and not remarried, it's not gonna ask you for information but for only the one parent. That's a good question. I can understand how that could be confusing, but the FAFSA has that skip logic, and it would only ask you for the one parent since they're divorced and not remarried.
Thank you. I didn't know that. But that is all the questions in the chat at this moment.
Okay. So really briefly, I just wanted to touch on, and we mentioned this a couple of times, the TASFA. I've got a couple of screens in just to explain what the TASFA is. Just a couple more resources. We talked about this before, how to access the FAFSA at FAFSA.gov, the My Student Aid app, and then the TASFA, which I'm going to discuss now. But a good resource for the TASFA is the collegeforalltexans.com. You can get more information on the TASFA, and you can actually get the application. collegeforalltexans.com. So the TASFA is for residents of Texas that are not eligible for federal financial aid. So if you're not eligible for federal aid, you live in the state of Texas, you may possibly qualify for state aid. It's used by colleges in Texas, and it's really like it's a FAFSA-like form. The questions are very similar. In fact, they're almost verbatim when they can be. It's really like completing a paper FAFSA because it's not online yet. So the requirements are, if you graduated from a high school or you received a GED in Texas, you reside in Texas for 3 consecutive years before you graduate or you receive your GED. And then after that, you reside in Texas for a year leading up to college enrollment, which is really most students or moving from high school, moving to college. And so that's part of that. Also, during the admissions process, students have to sign a notarized affidavit of intent that states if you're not in a permanent or legal status, then as soon as you're eligible for that status, then you will. So those are the requirements, and it's primarily, lived in Texas 3 years before graduating from high school and are receiving your GED. And those students can become eligible for state financial aid. Again, you're not going to be eligible for federal aid. So the timeline is just like the FAFSA. This is the time that you would be completing the TASFA. You will apply for admissions. Most colleges will accept the TASFA. Those that don't will accept a FAFSA. You complete the TASFA because it's a paper form. You make copies of it, and then you make original signatures and you send it to the colleges that you're going to attend. I'm just going to talk about just about 3 more slides. And again, these sections are very similar to the FAFSA: student information, dependency status, and parental information. This is what the TASFA looks like. Again, it's a paper form or it's a downloadable or fillable PDF. You have to enter the information. One question that and so whether you are a new student or you are a returning student currently in college, you're filling out the same form. Question number 6 sometimes throws students off because it asks for the college student ID number. On the TASFA, if a question doesn't apply to you, don't leave it blank. Either write, some have the option of not applicable, but if it's not applicable, make sure you put NA or not applicable, because you want the financial aid administrator to know that you didn't skip the question. It's just not applicable, and they may be confused. And you can see, just as like those, this question, your college, your status when you're grade level B, never attended college, which is no credits, but your first year undergraduate, if you have college credits, but you're gonna be, either no college credits, never attending college, or first year undergraduate, if you have college credits. That's a little distinction. This question's over to the right, the bachelor's degree, the associate's degree, very similar to the FAFSA. There's a question of selective service. If you're under 18, you don't have to register for selective service. But if you are registered with selective service, you'll click here, and then you'll have to submit proof that you're registered with selective service. If you don't have that yet, then you'll check that you'll submit proof of your registration. Once you get the proof of the registration, make a copy of it and then send it to the college. The dependency status determination, these are the same questions that we discussed in the FAFSA. It asks for the marital status. It asks that you have children that are receiving half of their support, or dependents, or you're an emancipated minor. So those very same questions, which actually they're a bit lengthier here. Here's the parental information, asking for the parent's marital status. There's a question that asks for the parent's social security number, DACA number, or NA. If there is no social security number, then make sure that you check NA. And it asks for parent 1 and for parent 2. Next is the income information. To the left is the student's information. To the right is the parent's information. If the parents filed taxes, or if the student filed taxes, they would put that information here. If they receive wages in cash, you would use that in question number 74. And so the previous slide is if taxes were filed, you'd put that information there. If taxes, or if you were paid in cash, or if taxes weren't filed, then you would put that information here under question 74. Again, if you paid taxes on this, don't put it here. This is cash earnings that taxes were not paid on. And I just listed the income threshold. If you met the income threshold, then you must file taxes. I listed that for the benefit of the parents and the students. Next is the household information. The household information, very similar, except with the main difference is they're asking for the names of the household members, but that same rule applies. The first one is for the student, and they're also asking for the age of the person. So household members, their names, their age, their relationship to the student. And it's the full name of the household members. Next is the sign section where the student will sign and the parent will sign. But before you do that, I recommend actually completing the FAFSA, printing the FAFSA, and then signing an original or a wet signature. Don't sign it and then make copies, because most institutions want to see an original signature. And so if you're applied to 5 schools, then you should be sending a TASFA to 5 schools. Complete the TASFA, print it, and then sign and date it, 1 student and 1 parent. Now, I realize that I kind of went over this really quickly, but I did because a lot of the information was covered and a lot of it is very similar to the FAFSA. Most of the information is similar. There are some nuances that are a bit different, primarily because this form is an online form. Now, good news is that students that are the class of 2022, starting next academic year, next FAFSA year, this form is going to be available online. So we look forward to that. I'll stop now to see if there's questions about the TASFA or to see if there are questions about any of the other information that I covered.
Thank you, Rich. There is a question, kind of a follow-up to a question asked earlier. So if parents are divorced and children have always, if parents are not divorced and children have always lived with mom, biological dad does not provide any support to children, but biological dad makes significantly more money than the mother that the children are living with, does that impact the student's ability to get financial aid?
Let me see if I can interpret that. The parents aren't divorced, but they don't live together?
Correct.
The question asks, are they divorced or separated? And so you would check that they are separated. They're going to ask for the date and year that they're separated, and then you would use only mom's information since they live with mom. And so the question does read, it's a pull-down menu, divorced or separated or remarried. And so on this particular one, you would list that they are separated. It would ask the month and the year that they were separated. And then you're only going to use the mom's information.
Thank you. And then there's a question.
I want to add one thing also, and this is probably the question that I probably get the most in over the 20 years that I've been doing this, that I usually get it from parents. And parents will want their son or daughter to be an independent because they don't carry them or they don't use them on their taxes. But whether or not a student is independent or dependent isn't related to a tax filing status of the parents, or whether or not the parents use them on their taxes, or whether students file their own taxes. There's not a correlation to whether a student is independent or dependent based on how the parents file their taxes.
Thank you for that clarification. So there's a question here that's asking, where can you find more information on specific questions or private questions? We do have a FAFSA event coming up next week on the 7th, 8th, and 9th. And I did put that link in the chat. So you can you can sign up for one of those appointment slots, and we will have additional FAFSA experts there to answer your questions. It is a webinar based appointment. So we will pull you into a breakout room with just yourself, a high school counselor from one of our high schools in the district, and also a FAFSA expert if you need them, that will be able to answer any specific questions that you may have. So I put that link in the chat so you can click on that. It's a You Can Book Me link, and it will give you an option for various different appointment slots. And then if you have questions beyond that, you can always contact your high school counselor as well. We do have a couple more questions for you, Richard.
Okay.
Do we have to submit both the FAFSA and the TASFA? I think this is from someone who came in just a little bit late.
No, you should never complete. You should complete one or the other. If you're eligible to complete the FAFSA, then it's only the FAFSA. The TASFA is for those students, those families that aren't eligible for federal financial aid. It is possible they may be eligible for state financial aid. There's never a situation where you would complete them both, because if you're eligible to complete the FAFSA, then you don't need to complete the TASFA. The TASFA is that application if you're not federal aid eligible to qualify for state financial aid.
Thank you. And actually, we don't have any more questions. These were just comments for you. They were saying, thank you. This information has been very helpful.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Also, one other thing, and I meant to say, and I said it earlier, utilize the feature at the end of each question, that question mark. That's extremely helpful. They've added some additional information. And so you're reading a question, you're not quite sure. If you'll click on that question mark, it'll take you to a different screen with an explanation. And sometimes even at that screen will be a link that you can get a deeper dive into get additional information.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone that was able to join us tonight. We will provide this information on our website, Counseling Services, the district's website, within the next 24 to 48 hours. Thank you again so much for joining us today. Like I mentioned, if you have any questions or you need assistance, you can join us for one of those appointment slots next week. And as always, you can contact your high school counselor.
Thank you so much.